to Richard first.
Quick rotation, and then Senator Williams. So Senator Di Natale, and then I'll come to you.
Thanks very much. I want to go back to the issue of Australia Post and the delivery of financial services. So can you tell me how much of your activities are now split between postal services as against financial and government services?
So, I'm so sorry.
Yes, I know there's a bit of distraction over there from Senator Williams. Yes, I'll repeat the question and I'll get some of Senator Williams' time now, I think. How much of your activities are split between postal services as against financial and government services?
So perhaps I could just step back for a moment. Letters last year was about 2.4 billion. Parcels is about 2.4 billion. Roads, about 600 million. Our post offices turned over about 1.1 billion, about 350 million in financial services in total. We do many different types of financial services, Senator, but that was its entirety.
So 350 million, did you say?
Of which 40 million approximately would be bank at post. So a very small percentage in terms of our revenues, but not necessarily of our work. Mm-hmm. It's about 10% of the work that we do in the post office.
So it's 10% of the work, and I suppose I'd have to do a very rough calculation, but it looks like a much smaller percentage, a couple of percent, if that, of your total revenue. It'd be a couple of percent, if anything, of your total revenue.
Oh, yes. Yes, not even 1%.
Okay. Is that part of the business growing?
Yes, it's growing very rapidly.
And is that just sort of a consequence of the sort of changing nature of other parts of the business, digital disruption and so on, and that people are seeing the role for Australia Post in delivering essential banking services?
I think there are two different factors impacting it. First of all, undoubtedly, bank branch closures are impacting the growth in the service, because people have got nowhere else to go. That is definitely impacting the service. And secondly, what's happening with increasingly, if I may use this term, in the old days, people worked with one bank, had their mortgage, their credit card and everything else with them. These days, increasingly, people work with multiple different banks and so often come to Australia Post as a safe, reliable place where they could do multiple different transactions rather go to 4 different places.
Okay. You said that there's a $50 million loss from running those services?
Yes.
Can you just account for where does that come from? You mentioned security is one aspect, and that's something you've obviously got to pay for. What other costs are incurred in running those services?
Well, first of all, you have to pay our licensed post office partners. We have to pay our own workforce.
Sorry, pay your licensed post office partners. What does that mean?
So if somebody comes into a post office and they want to deposit an amount of money, the post office gets paid for taking that money and processing it for them.
No, but how do you end up with a $50 million loss?
Because of the volumes of transactions, the amount of money that we've been receiving from the banks to date, and the amount that we have to pay out to other partners, and particularly then on top of that, so our licensed post office partners, our own employees, and the provision of security and IT services to support the business.
Okay, so all those mean that even though you've got $40 million in revenue coming in, you're running at a $50 million loss because of all of those additional things that aren't taken into account.
That's correct.
So you've now got this, what you called a landmark partnership with 3 of the 4 big banks at $22 million each, and obviously you made some very strong statements about the ANZ in your opening statement. The Financial Review today reports some comments from CEO Shayne Elliott where he indicates that the cost of the transaction fee, he would be interested in upping that, but the reality is that when compared to the big 3, there's a huge difference, and that he feels that he's been treated unfairly. Can you explain why he's wrong? And you indicated that you believed he was wrong in terms of the quotes he was making around the transaction fee.
I most definitely believe it is misleading. First of all, we need to provide these services whether 1 or 1,000 people go. The fees been offered to all the banks are exactly the same. No bank is being charged multiples of any other bank. We charge an access fee, and then the more times you use it, you pay a varying transaction fee. I think
So there's some fixed costs and some variable costs?
That's right.
Yep.
And so the rates are exactly the same for any one bank. We need to provide the service, and what's
Can
quite
I just
different,
ask you, is that also for banks that aren't part of the Big Four?
No, only the Big Four, Senator, and the reason for this is that 85% of our volume of this service is the Big Four, and where our costs have accelerated is alongside where we've had these branch closures in rural and regional Australia. You know, it's the Peter and Susie Wilsons of this world where we need to go in immediately and put them extra security in. That's a cost nobody sees. When we help banks, when they announce branch closures, and we go into those communities and try and help their people, we're not paid for that service. It takes up a significant amount of time of both our own people and our licensed post office partners.
So Mr Elliott says we'd be happy to double or triple the cost per transaction. He wants to move to what looks like a more fee-for-service model. Tell me why the other three have not have been satisfied with the arrangement and Mr Elliott isn't.
Senator, I have to be very careful I don't speak on behalf of Mr Elliott, but what I can say is that I personally have been involved in talking with Mr Elliott since the 22nd of January. The community representation fee is not a new idea. We actually have put forward 3 different proposals. The last proposal was agreed by all 3 major banks. Our costs were reviewed by KordaMentha, actually at the request of the government, not by Australia Post, in order to give the 4 major banks some kind of reassurance that our costs were real. KordaMentha, Mark Korda, agreed to meet with any of the banks who wanted to challenge what we were doing. Mark Korda met with ANZ. ANZ specifically was the first bank to ask me to really check competition rules. And it was doing that we became, we are a post office, not a bank. We became very aware that we had to treat all 4 banks exactly the same. It was actually ANZ who has to have in our agreements that if we did an agreement with one bank, we wouldn't the next day just go and lower the price with another. 3 banks have signed up, number 1, 2, and number 4. Number 3 have chosen not to. The number of customers they quote, I do not recognise, nor do our licensed post office partners. If they don't want to use this service, then I respect that.
What are the implications, though, if they don't?
I don't know. Last night, Mr. Elliott was saying on Twitter, and I think was saying that article you're referring to, that he will have alternatives for these customers. I don't know what they are. I've asked ANZ, can we get our communication team to work together to give clarity for these customers?
Well, I've got a story here that says, for example, if you're in Trafalgar, that you've now said to the customers of Australia Post, who are ANZ customers, that you can no longer provide that service, and that customers are now going to have to visit the Moe branch, which is, I don't know how far it is from Trafalgar, and here it says 10 k's, I'm not sure if that's right. And so basically, the implication clearly here of ANZ not joining in is that some of their customers in one rural community in Victoria are going to have to now drive, I imagine, with large amounts of cash, if they're small businesses, to deposit them at another either bank or Australia Post Office in Moe.
Senator, I've offered ANZ to go on the agreement the same as the other 3 banks. I've offered them an alternative where they can actually just sign up for 1 year at a time to make sure while they work through whatever their strategic options are, that customers can still have access.
And they refused a 1 year agreement?
And they have not yet signed a 1 year agreement.
Have you said that you might start charging dead people? That might make them more attracted to your services.
I don't know what fare. I'm so sorry, Senator, but I don't know what fair is. Fair is being able to recoup our costs and to be able to make sure our people are safe.
Well, perhaps I'll just move on to, I just want to talk about the proportion of your branches, just explore this idea of banking, the proportion of your branches that are in regional and remote Australia compared to urban centres.
65% of all of Australia Post facilities are in remote and regional Australia. Just over 2,500 of our 4,357 network are in rural and regional Australia.
And how many of those branches offer banking services?
And in total, there are 3,500 that offer, of the 4,357, 3,500 that offer banking services.
So it seems to me that you're in this ideal position where you've got a whole regional and rural network that's providing a range of services. Obviously, many of them are already providing those services for people through other banks. And you're obviously helping many of those small businesses. I know that's a big focus for you. Do you see the possibility of... do you have an ADI licence, an authorised deposit taking institution licence?
No, we do not.
So that's obviously with the banks, and you're able to offer that service through your partnership with the banks. Have you looked at perhaps offering... I mean, we know, for example, Kiwi Bank in the NZ actually offer their own banking product. Is that something that Australia Post has explored? And perhaps just to ask that and exploring potentially taking out an ADI licence so you can offer your own products?
Senator, I have very strict guidelines about what I'm allowed to work with and what I'm not. And the strict guidelines that I'm, an ADI is not for Australia Post.
So, I mean, given you've got this situation with ANZ customers, I mean, isn't one option to be able to offer a product yourself? And I suppose, let me ask you the question in this way, because I understand the restrictions within. Do you have the capacity, if you were to have an ADI licence, to be able to offer those services and a discrete product in the same way that Kiwi Bank does?
When Kiwi Bank set up their services, they actually had to invest significantly in technology and all the sort of smarts behind it in the back. We don't have that today. If these ANZ customers, if ANZ choose not to join our service, and I have deep respect for their CEO, by the way, if they choose not to join our services, then the other banks, there are 70 financial institutions that we work with at Australia Post, have offered to help those customers and switch them over.
Yes, I understand that, but we also know how difficult it is for people to switch banks. It sounds good in theory, but in practice it's
very traumatic.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So the question, I suppose, is the capacity for you to be able to deliver those services through effectively becoming a low-cost people's bank yourselves. You said that part of the issue is the sort of back of house, the IT, the security and so on. I imagine you have a pared down or a version of that to be able to offer the services that you're delivering at the moment. Is that correct?
As part of what we need to do the investment in, I think it was Senator Urquhart or yourself asked me earlier, is the technology to be able to do the transactions with the banks. But they have a whole set of different technology which enables them to look at whether someone should have a loan or not. We do not have that capability inside Australia Post today.
Okay.
And that's what the Kiwi Bank went and built.
Yes. I suppose one other way of doing that is to look to see whether there are any other smaller financial institutions, banks, that would be prepared to, in partnership with you, effectively establish a product. Is that also another model, so that at least you're able to utilise their IT and infrastructure that might exist and scale that up?
Interestingly, the stories regarding our Bank at Post story, the news on Bank at Post in the last couple of weeks, have raised the attention with lots of people who've come forward offering to do that. But we do not.
Do you want to explain that just a bit more?
Well, there are many people who would love to be in a position to be a major player with Australia Post who have much smaller banks or online banks. So.
And they've approached you?
they've approached me. Of course, you know, we've got the most trusted brand in the community.
Yes. Well, tell us about that. I mean, you know, at a time when banks are at their very lowest ebb, you guys are obviously reasonably well-trusted institution. Do you have any metrics on that?
I can't really... Look, we are the most trusted brand in the community.
How do you know that? I mean, you say that, but how do you, on what basis are you making that claim?
Because continuously there is research. Just recently, Access Economics produced a piece of research on Australia Post. It's why I happen to know about the 1,550 communities with only a post office and no bank branch. 91% of adults said that they regularly visit a post office, on average 6 times a year. So, actually it was 10 times in 6 months, I apologise. So we know it from independent research. Our post, particularly our licensed post offices, I mean, Dave should really speak about this, they're actually run by people in the community who've been in those communities for many years. They're known, well-trusted, well-respected. And equally, many people, 95% of all passports, Senator, happen in an Australia Post Office. People trust them to go in and go through that process. We don't make the decision whether someone should have an Australian passport or not, but we facilitate those people going through that process.
Okay, I think that probably wraps it up for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Di Natale. Senator Williams.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Holgate, thank you for being here. In relation, do you know any figures when it comes to the $22 million paid by CBA, Westpac and NAB? Who does the most transactions, CBA?
CBA would make the highest number of transactions. They're the largest bank.
Yeah. Is this the argument ANZ are putting forward? Imagine CBA did 22 million transactions a year, that's $1 a transaction. NAB and Westpac did 11 million, so that's $2 a transaction. ANZ only did about 5 million, which would be $4 a transaction. Is this their argument they're putting forward? They do less transactions than the other big three?
They are arguing, not necessarily than the other big three, they are actually the third largest bank in Australia.
Right.
But they are arguing...
to rural transactions, I thought they might have been less. But
they are arguing that they are smaller than, I think today they quoted the Sydney banks, the 2 large Sydney banks. Our costs are not, don't just occur by the absolute volume or the absolute value of transactions. It goes back to the example, you know, of what we were just talking about, the rural post office in Queensland. You know, there's a small post office where overnight we had to put in a safe, armour guard to go.
You've been there, you understand.
Multiple times, but that added $50,000 of cost into our network immediately. Now, we're not paid for that. No matter the number of value of those transactions that we do with that post office will ever compensate us for that. Yeah. But Australia Post is about giving a community service. Whether you are a customer who goes and wants to a branch or 100 times, we're here for everyone.
Yeah, good day. On to Australia Post, the LPOs. You've got about 2,800 of them when I was chairing a committee here years ago. How are they performing? Have you got many in trouble? Because we know we had an extensive hearing, more money paid to the LPOs because they were doing it really tough, especially the small community ones. How are the LPOs performing?
Well, we have roughly 4,357 overall post offices and post points.
I'm aware of
Of that, about 800 are corporate owned and about 3,500 are licensed post offices.
Right.
You know, often our licensed post office partners talk to me about the need to have increased payments. Their business has changed so significantly. Predominantly, they would have been in a world of letters. We've talked about those letter volumes coming down. And now they're in a world of parcels and increasingly bank at post operations. That's why increasing this minimum fee by 25% is so important for them. But I may just ask Dave, who runs the post offices nationally, he can give you a little bit more detail.
Thank you. Dave McNamara, General Manager of the Post Office Network. Thank you, Senator. We've actually seen, obviously, a lot of our post offices have been in trouble, so been working through with them. We've worked through around what we did with minimum payments, so we've increased that since the Senate inquiry, working through with our post officers, and we're also currently working through the payment review. And we know as part of that payment review, it's ensuring that we actually balance the work based upon the work that the outlets are doing, and looking at what other capabilities we can work with our small outlets and actually giving them other sources of revenue. So looking at buying programs, how we help them actually get merchandise in there. So we're looking to support them in a lot of ways right across the network.
When will this review be completed?
We're looking to have that wrapped up by the end of this year.
Yeah, 'cause I know during our inquiry the LPOs were getting the raw end of the deal when it came to the parcel handling. We're well aware of the huge drop-off in letter volumes. I think it's 400 billion emails a year or something sent in Australia, huge amount. And we're aware of that, so that'd be good, and I hope your considerations and your inquiry into the LPOs keeps them financially alive, because they are essential service, especially in the regional small communities.
Definitely.
Thanks, Chair.